D. James Kennedy Ministries presents Truths That Transform.
Christianity and freedom go hand in hand. So what happens when America's Christian foundations are rejected?
We thought we had a democratic republic with self-government, and now we're being ruled by a king who uses his pen to issue edicts right and left.
We investigate the very real danger to you and your children from a rising government totalitarianism on today's Truths That Transform. Welcome to Truths That Transform, a production of D. James Kennedy Ministries, where we are standing for truth and defending your freedom. As a people, we have become accustomed to a pervasive government that reaches into every area of our lives, from our health care to the education of our children to what kind of toilet tank you're allowed to have. But God offers His people liberty. And our founding fathers battled for that God-given freedom. But today, radical forces are at work among us to make government even more intrusive and to diminish individual freedom. The COVID pandemic is just the latest opportunity for government expansion, as powerful leftist elites will make use of any crisis to rule by fiat and put your freedoms directly at risk. Our own David Wright takes a closer look.
America is facing a crisis. We have freedom at risk in a country that's had it for 240 years. We're seeing one-party government arise.
As one of the founders said, a government big enough to give you everything you want can take everything you have. And what we see is now is a growing, expanding government that has taken away our freedoms.
At the inception of America, the Founding Fathers recognized the importance of having a limited government, hence the reason for having a separation of powers. But today we've seen many in the government attempt to gain more and more power through unconventional methods.
We've seen a trend for years of a growing state, in fact, government at all levels. But a lot of us never thought it could go this fast, this far. It's shocking. And even some liberals are waking up and saying, whoa, this is not what we had in mind. We have checks and balances for a reason. We saw what happens to nations that just have kings who can abuse their power. That's why America's founders went to so much trouble to divide the powers. And their idea was to put most of the power in the hands of the group closest to the people, which was the legislature, and in particular, the House of Representatives.
There has been a recurring theme throughout U.S. history of presidents usurping their enumerated powers.
Presidents, unfortunately, have a history of taking a license with the executive authority and doing all kinds of damage to the United States of America. For instance, Woodrow Wilson, in the early part of the 20th century, was highly uncomfortable with the Constitution. He was highly uncomfortable with the power that constitutionally was vested in the presidency. And in fact, he felt that in the progressive era, and as the first major progressive president, that in fact those lines should become more fuzzy between the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And Woodrow Wilson is the first president in a major way to go outside of those bright lines.
Many will remember FDR's plan to bring America out of the Great Depression.
It continued, of course, in a major way with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the so-called New Deal, with the explosion of the role of the federal government in the average lives of Americans. It was almost unprecedented, all done through executive authority.
It is clear that there are those in government who will take advantage of a crisis to assert more power and control. Look at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think that the whole COVID pandemic has had a huge impact two ways. One, it has allowed people in government to abuse their power. shut down churches and treat them differently from other institutions. The other thing is that people can see the ways government can use a crisis to its advantage and have to be more alert than ever. So this is a wake-up call. America is waking up.
When you look at what's happened with COVID-19, we've seen a lot of incursions on constitutionally guaranteed rights and liberties. Now, COVID-19 might seem to be new, but if you look at it in terms of a medical pandemic, America has had a major medical pandemic about every 15 years since way back in the 1600s. It's not a new thing to have a pandemic. It's a new thing to have a pandemic where that civic officials ignore what the Constitution says and what the laws say, and they do what they want to do.
Another ploy for the federal government to aggregate more power is with the so-called climate crisis.
If you go back to the 1970s, started with global cooling. That didn't come to pass. Then that matured into global warming, which really hasn't come to pass either. They haven't had this green revolution that the left wants. Now they've turned climate change, climate weirding is my favorite term that they've come up with.
I find that when you're talking with actual climate scientists, geologists, oceanographers, atmospheric chemists and physicists and so on, you don't find, I think, anybody who believes the alarmist catastrophe around the corner message. Where you find this is with popularizers, with movement environmentalists, with people like Al Gore, politicians who see it as a way to promote their political careers.
In early 2019, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced a climate bill known as the Green New Deal. A bill that, if passed, would have been a massive government intrusion and would have resulted in the potential destruction of the U.S. economy.
The Green New Deal that has been pushed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is something that simply will never fly. A fairly conservative estimate as to what it would cost to implement the Green New Deal puts it at around $500 billion a year for the U.S. economy. The Green New Deal is predicated on the notion that human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane are causing such rapid and high magnitude global warming as to be catastrophic in the consequences over a fairly short period of time. Even if we're talking toward the end of this century on geologic scales, that's a pretty short period of time. The scientific basis for that notion is essentially zero. There is none.
The Green New Deal would destroy American prosperity as we know it.
While the Green New Deal was never passed, the Biden administration is currently trying to ram an infrastructure bill through Congress that has many of its radical climate policies.
It killed thousands of jobs and made us more dependent on foreign oil, just when America had achieved energy independence. This makes no sense at all, unless you're a climate extremist. And his administration appears to be populated with just those folks. In fact, they're using climate as a way to impose more and more government and more restrictions on what Americans can do.
Many fear that the Biden administration is encroaching on our rights yet again, as it signals a willingness to pack the U.S. Supreme Court. A bill was introduced in Congress in April 2021 that would add 4 additional seats to the Supreme Court.
When President Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court back in the 30s because the Supreme Court wouldn't go along with his socialistic New Deal schemes, he got pushback because people thought that was a bridge too far.
The proposal or the argument of that the left is going to pack the court is a really horrific idea. If people don't know what that means, it means we've had, for over 150 years, we've had 9 justices on the Supreme Court. This packing the court means I don't like what the court's rulings are, and so what I'm going to do is my party has control. We're going to add justices to the Supreme Court. So there's now going to be 13, and we're going to put 4 liberals on the court so that we get the opinions that we want. Packing the court means destroying the Supreme Court. Because if you add 4 and your party is in control now, as soon as you get out of power and the other party gets in, they're going to add 4 or 5 so they have control. The court is no longer an independent legal body. It's a pure political body.
With the very real threat of government overreach infringing on our rights, we should be wary of losing the liberties and freedoms that we enjoy today.
We thought we had a democratic republic with self-government, and now we're being ruled by a king who uses his pen to issue edicts right and left.
What this ultimately means, and this is what is really chilling, is that whatever right you care about, your right to free speech, your right to freedom of religion, your right to Second Amendment, you name your right, that right is no longer a right. It's a privilege that the ruling party gives you if they so decide.
We are forced to pledge allegiance not to God but government. And there has become a secular religion that is a part of this big government that forces all other faiths out. And there's only a faith to the state and what government can do. That's a dangerous place to be. We should not be dependent upon government. As Christians, our calling is to trust in God. In God we trust, not government.
We have forgotten true freedom because we've forgotten God. And having forgotten God, America has become a people that increasingly depend on government to be their provider, protector, and comforter. But as the founding generation declared, the general principles of Christianity were also the principles of true freedom. Today, you'll have a fight on your hands if you even observe that America was established on Christian principles. That's because modern Americans are historically ignorant, and often willfully so. Dr. D. James Kennedy sets the record straight in this portion of his message, God and Country.
Our subject is God and Country. Now, I know that in our land today, there are those who are uncomfortable. In fact, there are those who positively detest the idea of any connection between God and country. There are those who would like to efface the words "In God We Trust" as our national motto. There are those who would like to remove them from our coins. There are those who would like to remove every vestige of God and Christianity from our public life. And yet, all of those indeed are aliens to the spirit which gave birth to this country. Our nation was born in the hearts of men and women who loved God, who trusted in Jesus Christ as the divine Redeemer and Savior of the world, and who came here for His glory, and established a nation that was intended to advance the Christian faith and glorify God. That is what is sometimes called the American Covenant. Now, authors Foster and Swanson have produced a very excellent book entitled The American Covenant. And it deals with an aspect of the founding of this country which is often overlooked or perhaps totally unknown by many. And that is that the founders of this nation were biblical Christians, and they understood that God's relationship to man was in the form of a covenant. And so when they came into this country, they established a covenant with God. And they asked His blessings upon them, and they promised that they would do certain things. Now, the initial form of that covenant is what we know as the Mayflower Compact. You will recall that those 100 or so pilgrims had left England for Holland in order to escape religious persecution after 12 years in Holland, where they found toleration but not complete freedom. They finally decided at last to sail for the New World, that they might freely worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. And they landed at Cape Cod, but before setting foot upon the rocky coasts of New England, they gathered together in the cabin of the Mayflower and drew up the Mayflower Compact, that document which has come to be known as the birth certificate of America, but which is in fact the American covenant, the covenant between the founders of this country and God. You remember well the words, "In the name of God, amen," it begins, and goes on to say, "Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia." I want you to note well that they begin it in the name of God, and they say that they have undertaken to plant a colony in Virginia for two purposes: the purpose of the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. Now, these were the dual aspects of this covenant. Listen to the first American historian. That, of course, was William Bradford, who was governor of the Plymouth colony and who wrote the first history on American soil, a Plymouth plantation. And he says that they came here and founded this colony with, quote, "a great hope and inward zeal that they had of laying some good foundation, or at least to make some way thereunto, for the propagating and advancing of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ to these remote parts of the world. Yea, though they should be but even as stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work." And we know, of course, that that wish has been fulfilled, that America has become the greatest missionary force in the history of the world. From here, the gospel has gone out not only to Japan and Korea and China and the South Seas, but to every part of the world. And it was part of the original covenant that they had, with an inward zeal of advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. So this was their purpose in founding this land. It was a Christian land that they founded. Now today, there are those who gnash their teeth at the very mention of the fact that this was founded as a Christian nation. But my friends, the facts of history are not easily dismissed. For those moderns who would say that America has nothing to do with Christianity and that our Constitution and Declaration are not Christian, they obviously know nothing about the principles of Christianity which completely underlay all of the various facets of the foundations of this country. The highest glory, said John Quincy Adams, of the American Revolution was that in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government and the principles of Christianity were forever united. And yet, for those who will take the time to read, you cannot miss the plain facts, that the principles and institutions, the foundations of the life of this country were indeed in every way biblical and Christian in their nature. My friends, we need to do what these very pilgrims set out to do. We need to re-grasp and rededicate ourselves to that American covenant, that we will believe that we are here on these shores and have been born on these shores or have come into them for the purpose of the glory of God, to glorify God. And they did this in every sphere of activity. They brought the principles of their Christian faith into every institution, whether it be education or government or media or art or whatever it was, literature. The principles of Christianity diffused all things. And we need to realize that we're here, secondly, for the advancement of the Christian faith. My friends, we can never hope to bring America back to the foundations which made it great if we renege upon the responsibility to fulfill the Great Commission to share the gospel with all people. We have no doubt far more heathen in America today than existed when the pilgrims stepped off of the Mayflower onto this land. Far more people in this country today who do not know the living God, who do not trust in Jesus Christ as his Son. We have a task set before us today for the advancement of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you can be that missionary right here to America, right here on these shores, to take the gospel to those all about you who know not the Lord. My friends, if we do not do that, and if secularism and godless unbelief take over this country, then the calamities that are going to fall upon this country can already be written down. The loss of our freedoms, to be ground under the heel of tyranny and despotism, to experience the various plagues that come upon the godless. This inevitably is what awaits America.
As Dr. Kennedy just made clear, without biblical truth, America will fall prey to a secular tyranny. The 20th century showed us the cost of nations that reject God and concentrate power in the hands of humans. It's measured into the hundreds of millions of deaths at the hands of tyrants. By contrast, America's founders gave us a limited government designed to protect us from tyranny and ensure liberty. And it was all premised on a Christian worldview. With a presidential administration bent on imposing radical environmental initiatives, enormous tax hikes, and socialistic redistribution of wealth through trillions of dollars in spending, it has never been more important to know and stand for truth. That's why I have written the short book, Executive Overreach, The Tyranny of Concentrated Power. And I want to send it to you as my thanks for your generous gift to help us proclaim truth and defend freedom across our great nation. Simply write to us at D. James Kennedy Ministries, Box 11154, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 33339. Or call toll-free 877-962-7677. Or go online to djkm.org. In his first few months in office, President Biden issued more executive order fiats than any president in history over that same time frame. And he has appointed some of the most radical leftists in American history to serve in his cabinet. All of this poses a danger to you and your freedom. In this booklet, I explain why. You'll want to read this and also share it in your own circle of influence. If you're able to give a generous donation of $50 or more, we will send you my book plus the 7 DVD set from Dr. D. James Kennedy, America at the Tipping Point. This set features Dr. Kennedy's most influential messages on America's Christian foundations. You saw a snippet of his powerful message, God and Country, just a few moments ago. And this set contains the full version of that message, plus 6 more, like America, a Christian Nation, The Spirit of Liberty, and more. No one argued as clearly and successfully for the Christian foundation of America than Dr. Kennedy. And this set of messages represents the creme de la creme of his teaching. We will send you my booklet, Executive Overreach, The Tyranny of Concentrated Power, as our thanks for your generous donation. And we will send you the booklet plus the 7 DVD set of messages from Dr. Kennedy, America at the Tipping Point, as our thanks for your much-needed donation of $50 or more. We Christians need to be clear about the truth and equipped to stand for it while there is still time, which seems to be running out quickly. Simply write to us at D. James Kennedy Ministries, Box 11154, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 33339. Or call toll-free 877-962-7677. Or go online to djkm.org. The corruption of language is Satan's oldest trick. In the Garden of Eden, God commanded Adam and Eve to eat from any tree they wished, except for one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan twisted God's words by asking Eve, "Did God really tell you not to eat of any tree in the garden?" Eve said no, but she still took the bait and twisted God's command into something more restrictive than it really was, claiming that God had told them they couldn't even touch it. They believed Satan's verbal manipulations, and it led to the downfall of all creation. Words are powerful, and as some have noted, today's cultural battles are in many ways battles over the dictionary. The left has been extraordinarily effective at deceptively manipulating language in order to get the results they want. In the past decade, they have successfully gotten the American public to buy into a complete redefinition of marriage, and even of the biologically basic terms male and female. And they have carried this success into the public policy arena as well. We are now told by the Biden administration, for example, that the word bipartisan no longer means something that is supported by elected officials from both political parties in Congress. Rather, the newspeak version of bipartisan means that everything the totalitarian left wants to do has some Republican support among the general public, and therefore, voila, everything is now bipartisan. Even the crystal clear word infrastructure no longer means only roads and bridges and airports and the like, but now includes anything the extreme left thinks is good for you, such as government-paid childcare and incentives for buying electric cars. You may have heard the old adage, how do you know when politicians are lying? When their lips are moving. But this bit of cultural sarcasm seems virtually true with the present administration. Many in the government and the media are lying to you, and they are using equivocal and deliberately misleading language in doing so. But as Christians, we must always be people of the truth and cut through manipulative language designed to deceive. For indeed, as the Scriptures tell us, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are His delight. D. James Kennedy Ministries is standing for truth and defending your freedom. I'm Frank Wright. Thanks for being with us. And here's a look at the next truths that transform.
To have the constant attacks on religious liberty within the military is especially egregious. When they have our backs defending our religious liberty.
That's next week. This has been a production of D. James Kennedy Ministries.